Hi, I'm BECMI Berserker and welcome back to my channel. A question you will very rarely get a consistent answer to in respect of BECMI and similar old school editions of Dungeons and Dragons is, how do you resolve combat? Well, stick around to the end because I'll be doing a demonstration. How to resolve combat seems like a straightforward question, which should have a straightforward answer. Combat in Dungeons and Dragons is pretty much a core feature of the game. The foundations of nearly all Dungeons and Dragons editions are seeking treasure, rescuing some people or something, or seeking answers to a mystery. 99.999% of these scenarios require combat to resolve, to a greater or lesser extent, but it's required nonetheless. So not having a straightforward answer to how do you do combat might seem very strange, especially when there are documented rules for it. Well, in this video I'm putting on my helmet and drawing my two-handed sword to wade into this area and offer you exactly that. A straightforward answer to how combat is resolved in BECMI, using the rules as written in the Rules Cyclopedia, the amalgamated Basic, Expert, Companion and Master Rules released in 1991. I've also consulted widely with the BECMI community to ensure a common understanding of these rules, but as I alluded to earlier, there are numerous deviations from the core steps I will present. If you disagree strongly with my understanding, well, roll initiative in the comments. One thing I will add though is that I hope to explain why so many groups deviate from the rules as written and have their own methods for resolving combat. And to wrap all this up, I will demonstrate the combat rules with an encounter to hopefully consolidate your understanding. So let's get into it. As with all editions of D&D, combat is broken down into rounds. In BECMI, a round is equal to 10 seconds. Therefore, there are 6 rounds in a minute. The actions in each combat round follow a process called the Combat Sequence Checklist, which is a way of managing the actions of each combatant. I'll be demonstrating the use of this soon. Combat occurs when an encounter turns into a battle. In BECMI, this may happen in one of 2 ways. The Dungeon Master may just inform the players that what they've encountered is hostile, or he or she may make what's called a reaction roll, using 2d6 and consulting with this table. The result of the reaction roll determines how a creature or creatures reacts to the party, which may range from attacking immediately to being friendly. The DM would play out what these results actually mean, but what the reaction roll offers the game is that a scenario is rarely the same twice. A group of kobolds might immediately attack a party in one game after reacting badly, or may be friendly to another party, perhaps seeking allies to rid them of the stinking goblins in the next cave. Who knows? But the reaction roll is an elegant little mechanic to mix up encounters and, perhaps, cause players to have to do something other than fight all the time. However, this video is all about fighting, so we're going to always assume a reaction roll has gone badly, or the DM just hates you and is flinging monsters in your direction. Now, all of what I'm about to go through is assuming that 2 parties are aware of each other. However, depending on the circumstances, the Dungeon Master may first want to determine if the party is surprised by the presence of the other. In BECMI, this is determined by rolling 1d6, and on a result of 1 or 2, a party is surprised, with the following results. If no party is surprised, then we can proceed normally. If both parties are surprised, then they spend 1 round both confused by the other's presence and unable to take any actions. If just one party is surprised, then the other party gets a free round to attack, if they wish, before both parties roll for initiative. As with all editions of Dungeons and Dragons, initiative is the term used to determine who acts first in combat, and then who acts next, etc. In BECMI, this is done by rolling a d6 and seeing who gets the highest result. Also in BECMI, there is a choice of 2 ways to determine initiative. There is group initiative, which is the standard rule, and individual initiative, which is described as optional. I'll go into detail about these soon. Each of these influences how the rest of a combat encounter proceeds. A Dungeon Master should discuss with their group which initiative method they will be using before beginning a game, so that players may adjust their choices accordingly. In addition, the rules state that the first action of a combat round is to roll initiative. This is taken to mean every combat round, so that where you are in the initiative order is never assured beyond the current round, preventing the use of your initiative placement as a round-by-round tactic, as circumstances out of your control can fluctuate. I really like this, as it adds to the chaos of combat. Later editions allow for all kinds of movement through the initiative order, and while there is a likeable element of choosing your moment to take your action, in a mass brawl, things rarely go to plan, least of all timing. Central to all combat in BECMI is what's called the Combat Sequence Checklist. This is essentially an order of actions that take place within a round of combat. Those of you new to BECMI might find this concept weird. I mean, if it's your go, why can't you just take your go and perform whatever action you wish? Well, the Combat Sequence Checklist is strongly linked to initiative. As you can see, the first action in the sequence is to roll for initiative. Then we have morale, an optional check for whether monsters flee. Then we have movement, so where characters are moving to in that round. Missile combat, which includes monster ranged attacks like breath weapons. We have magic, which includes magic item use. And lastly, hand-to-hand combat, commonly referred to as melee. The special element you can see at the bottom of the checklist refers to special conditions in a combat round that fall outside of the actions above. The combat maneuvers one can take in a combat round are listed here, along with when they may be performed in the combat sequence I just ran through. Take a moment to pause the video if you wish to read through them. So what's the point of the combat sequence checklist? Well, it was developed to offer an abstract version of realism in terms of rationalising the speeds of these actions within a combat round, whilst also supporting both group and individual initiative methods. Let's first look at group initiative. Group initiative requires the rolling of just 1d6 for each party, so if we had 4 adventurers battling 4 orcs, a single 1d6 is rolled for each side, and all members of the winning group go before the other party. There are usually no modifiers to this roll, but of course you can change that as you wish. With group initiative, there is the potential for a tie to lead to what's called simultaneous combat, which means both parties resolve their attacks at the same time. So if a creature gets killed in a round, they still have a chance to land a telling blow in return. Assuming no tie is had, the party with the highest result acts first, and all the creatures in the party get to take their actions before the party that lost the initiative roll. Therefore, if one party had surprised the other, using the surprise rule I mentioned earlier, and also wins the initiative, they would get 2 rounds of combat with no reply. Clearly, group initiative can be quite deadly. Once the initiative order is known, we refer to the combat sequence checklist to resolve actions. I'll not go through that now, as I'm going to demonstrate combat later in the video. For now, you just need to understand that combat is resolved in this order, with initiative being re-rolled at the beginning of each round. Now let me turn to the optional individual initiative rules. Individual initiative is likely to seem the most familiar method of rolling for initiative to players of recent editions of the game. It works by every player rolling 1d6 and the DM rolling 1d6 for every monster. There is a further optional rule for dexterity bonuses to be added to this roll, and although it seems a bit of a no-brainer to allow this, it does offer player characters a significant advantage over most monsters, as stat blocks in BECMI and other editions of this time did not include ability score entries for monsters. Therefore, monsters could not benefit from this optional rule. A DM may want to skew things in the player's favour, but they should be aware of this fact before allowing it. Or they could apply a bonus or penalty to monsters anyway, depending on whether a creature is naturally fast or slow. For example, you might award a big cat +2 to their initiative due to their agility. It's arbitrary, but it's flexible according to the situation. Ties in individual initiative do not result in simultaneous combat, and are dealt with by rolling off until resolved. An exception to this initiative order is for combatants wielding weapons with the two-handed property. These always lose initiative to those not using two-handed weapons when utilising the individual initiative rules. Essentially, two-handed weapon attacks are resolved at the back end of the round. Now, the practice of how individual initiative is resolved is probably the area of most fluctuation between the groups who use it. The rules state that individual initiative operates the same as normal initiative, meaning group initiative, but doesn't explicitly state what this means. Therefore, this has caused some players to continue to refer to the combat sequence checklist, and some players to resolve combat in much the same way as happens in modern editions. That is, each creature rolls initiative, as I've just explained, but takes all their movement and combat actions on their turn. This completely does away with the combat sequence checklist, with some groups even doing away with rolling for initiative every round. Admittedly, this method is the least complicated to understand, requiring no reference to charts and orders of combat, perhaps leading to its popularity. In the case of individual initiative that utilizes the combat sequence checklist, we would first see if a morale check is needed and go in order of initiative. This might result in some monsters wanting to run away before going back through the list to resolve any movement in initiative order. Once done, we would use the same method to resolve missile combat, magic, etc. Once all the actions of the checklist have been completed, then individual initiatives are rolled again, and we cycle back through the checklist once more. Now, I know what you're thinking. Using the combat sequence checklist surely slows down the game and makes it overcomplicated. Well, yes and no. You'll be surprised at how quickly you skirt over things, so it doesn't slow down that much. And in my opinion, it accounts for types of actions that are faster than others. You have to remember, in BECMI there are no bonus actions, reactions, feats, round-by-round conditions to account for, so combat resolves quickly anyway, meaning any slowdown would be minimal once this method is integrated into your game. A positive consequence of this method is how tactical the game becomes. For instance, when it comes to the movement phase of the checklist, each character may move in the initiative order, but at that point the reason for each movement may not be clear. Also, it allows for things like diving for cover, as a character may head for a convenient tree to stand behind before the missile combat phase, or perhaps a magic user elects not to move because they want to cast a spell. In BECMI, you must not be walking or running when you cast a spell, although Glantrian wizards have found a way around this. The poor magic user might find themselves dreadfully exposed as her companions go in a number of directions, with the missile combat phase still to be resolved before the spell is cast. Oh dear. And there we have it, 3 versions of initiative and combat action resolution, group, and 2 versions of individual initiative. No wonder there's a lot of fluctuation in approach. One popular house rule I have to mention at this stage is the declaration phase. The concept is that before rolling for initiative, each player must declare what they are doing. The result of the initiative roll means things either go well or very badly. For instance, the action you chose may no longer be relevant by the time you take your go. It also allows for spellcasters to commit to casting a spell at the beginning of a round, meaning there is the potential for them to be interrupted if someone gets to them first. The main reason for the popularity of the declaration phase is that combat is chaotic and things change so rapidly that your choices are quite often nugatory. However, I'm not sure this makes for a fun game, as players can get a bit dismayed when they are continuously useless due to poor initiative rolls. My main use for it would be to support the issue of spellcaster disruption, but I think this can be done more elegantly within the BECMI combat sequence checklist, which I will demonstrate soon. Okay, so before I demonstrate some combat and try to make sense of everything I've just said, I just want to cover off any lingering anxieties there might be about the potential understanding that combat rules in BECMI can be done a number of ways. Combat wasn't broken if you diverted here and there from the rules as written. No major advantage was gained or lost, so it became about what works easiest in your group rather than whether you were following the rules. The fact deviations are commonplace serve to demonstrate that the impact of house rules on running combat are minimal, further demonstrating the flexibility of the BECMI rule set. In fact, the unwritten rule of BECMI combat seems to be, you do you. Okay, enough chatting about the rules. Let's have a fight. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to run the same combat scenario twice, using both group and individual initiative with the combat sequence checklist to show you the differences between them. The party I will use to demonstrate this consists of a cleric, elf, magic user, dwarf, and halfling, all of whom are 2nd level. Please don't judge my tactics, these guys are feeling pretty suicidal today. I should just mention a couple of things to improve your understanding of what you'll be seeing. I'm using the Foundry Virtual Tabletop along with the Old School Essentials game pack, which I have edited a little to BECMify them. A pane on the left will display the initiative order, and a pane on the right will display the results from combat and initiative rolls. The creature whose go it is will be surrounded by a blue circle, with the creature to take their turn next showing a gold circle, although this may not always be the case when using the combat sequence checklist. You'll see what I mean as I go through it. The creature being targeted will be surrounded by arrows. If you see a large grey X, it just means that this is where the creature whose turn it is started their go. Also to note, this combat is gridless, so you will see tokens overlap squares and occupy space if their token allows it, so creatures may be easily surrounded if they're not careful. We'll start this demonstration with Group Initiative. A party of 5 has just wandered into the Caves of Chaos. This party consists of Belrain the Elf, Clarion the Cleric, Felonius the Magic User, Rolf the Dwarf, and Touchbury the Halfling. They have been spotted by a group of 6 goblins. The Dungeon Master rolls 1d6 to check if the party are surprised. A 6. The party are not surprised and spot the goblins down the passage. It's now time to roll for initiative. As this is group initiative, each party rolls 1d6, and the goblins win the initiative with a roll of 6, as the party only managed to roll 1. This means that all the goblins have their turns first as specified in the combat sequence checklist before the party does. As for who acts first within the group, I'll let Foundry decide this automatically, but most Dungeon Masters go around the table in a clockwise direction. Let's get the combat sequence checklist on the screen so that we can see what happens next. Well, this happens to be morale, but this is just kicking off, so everyone is feeling confident at the minute, so no morale check by the goblins is required. Next on the list is movement. Each of these squares is 5 feet, and the goblins have an encounter speed of 30 feet, which is the furthest distance they can move if they also wish to attack. The 4 goblins in front of this table are armed with short swords, but the ones behind it also have short bows. Therefore, the highlighted goblin must move towards the party to be effective. Let's move him here. Remember, this is just the movement phase, so all the goblins must move before the next phase. Let's do that now. As you can see, I have kept the goblin archers back, who take cover behind the table. Now that all the goblins have moved, it's time for the missile combat phase. Only the goblins behind the table have bows, so they both have an opportunity in this phase to harm the party. The first goblin spots one of his hated enemies, the dwarf, Rolf. He rolls but only manages a 12. He needs a 15 to hit Rolf's armor class of 4, so this is a miss. Now for the second goblin archer, who also takes aim at the dwarf and rolls a 7. Another miss. Rolf might not have a clue what shot at him, but the immortals seem to have him covered for the moment. As no other goblin has a missile weapon, this now ends the missile phase, and we're into the magic phase. No goblins have any access to spells or magical abilities, so we can just skip this part. And so we come to the hand-to-hand combat phase. Frustratingly, none of the goblins are in hand-to-hand range of the party, and now cannot take advantage of this phase. Clearly a poor use of tactics on the goblins' part. With nothing happening in this phase, initiative now passes to the party. Let's see what happens. We can skip straight past morale as it does not apply to player characters. And so we are in the party's movement phase. Felonius the Magic User stays where he is, so it is at this point that I would be asking the player of the Magic User if they intend to use a spell. They haven't moved, so casting a spell once we get to the magic phase would still be possible. However, elsewhere in the rules, it is stated that a spellcasting attempt is ruined if interrupted, but how this might happen in combat is not explicitly demonstrated anywhere. If I were not to ask the Magic User's player if they were casting a spell, then they could state this action in the magic phase without any threat of being interrupted in the previous missile phase. Therefore, in my opinion, I think it is essential that the action of spellcasting is stated in the movement phase. Where I don't take this approach is for magic item use, such as wands and scrolls, as I think this is another boon conveyed by the magic item. You may have a different opinion, and I'd love to hear it in the comments below, but for now, this is how I do it. Felonius's player states they are not going to cast a spell for now, instead electing to watch and see how things go. So now it's time for the rest of the party to conduct their movement phase, ensuring each character stays within their encounter movement range, like so. Touchbury elects to stay back to use his bow, but the others, apart from Felonious, close for hand-to-hand combat. Now it passes to the missile combat phase, and Touchbury may immediately attack any of the goblins in range. He chooses the one between Clarion and Belrain and fires his bow. He rolls a 15, meaning a total of 16 with his added bonuses, and he hits the goblin's armor class of 6 and deals 3 damage. These goblins only have 3 hit points each, so this poor goblin is off to the next life. With no more of the party using missile combat, we're into the magic phase. However, Felonious, Belrain, and Clarion are not casting spells, so we can pass straight to the hand-to-hand combat phase. Rolf is first to act and attacks the goblin in front of him with his sword, and only manages a total of 12. A miss. He begins to rethink his relationship with the immortals. It's now Clarion's turn, but he finds himself outside of hand-to-hand combat range of any of the goblins, because Touchbury shot the one in front of him. In fact, Belrain finds himself in the same situation, so perhaps Touchbury's choice of opponent during the missile phase wasn't a good one. As all the goblins and party members have gone through each of the phases in this round, it is time to roll for initiative again for round 2, as stated in the combat sequence checklist. This time the party roll highest, with a 5, and get to go through the phases again before the goblins get to reply. A massive stroke of luck. So back to the movement phase again, and Felonious stays where he is, assessing the situation. He has a sleep spell that could drop everyone, but doesn't want to waste it if it's not needed. The others move to get better positions on the goblins, all except for Belrain, who states his intention to cast a magic missile on one of the goblin archers, and therefore does not move. Into the missile phase, and as before, Touchbury is the only one who can act here. He takes aim at the furthest of the hand-to-hand goblins and gets a total of 5. Not good enough. So now we're in the magic phase. As mentioned earlier, Belrain stated his intention to cast magic missile, and now does so on one of the goblin archers. Magic missile hits automatically, and Belrain sends a dart of energy slamming into the goblin archer's throat, doing 4 damage and killing it instantly. Now we're into the hand-to-hand phase, and Rolf swings again at the goblin in front of him, rolling a total of 17 and doing a huge 8 points of damage. That goblin is geography, and goes down in a bloody mess. It's now Clarion's turn in the hand-to-hand combat phase, and he swings at the goblin before him, who is now looking a little worried. Swinging his mace, the cleric rolls a 19 and hits for 4 damage, caving the hapless goblin's skull in as it achieves the dead condition. Now that all of the party have acted in their respective phases, it's now the goblins' turn. Things have not gone well for them at all, so this dungeon master is going to test their morale during the morale phase. So let's test the morale of this guy. Goblins only have a morale score of 7, and this is checked using 2d6, with a score above that meaning the morale check is failed. This goblin gets an 8. He's out of there. But it's not the movement phase yet, so let's wait and see how this develops. The other remaining goblin also attempts a morale check, but this one succeeds on a 4. Perhaps he wants to cover the retreat of his goblin mate. Who knows? But we're now into the goblin movement phase, and the one who failed their morale check may now run away. They are currently not engaged in combat, so may run up to 3 times his speed away from the situation. In this environment, he runs southeast, past the archer body, and down the tunnel. The final goblin, although he made his morale check, decides not to stick around, and uses his movement phase to do the same. Both goblins retreat, and it is a victory for the party. But who knows where the goblins are going, and more importantly, what they're bringing back. So that was group initiative, and already you can spot the potential for tactical combat within the BECMI game, as choice of movement and opponent options affect those around you. When you've gone through it a few times, it becomes a really quick way of resolving combat, and the aspect of potentially gaining 2 rounds of actions before a response makes for some exciting play sometimes. Now let me show you the optional individual initiative rules, once again utilising the combat sequence checklist. We'll run through the same scenario and see if the result is any different. We won't bother with a surprise check this time, and just assume the 2 groups have seen each other at the same time. So let's roll individual initiative. Foundry has automatically organised the combatants in initiative order, so I'm just going to go with it for now, and it looks like a goblin is going to go first. How this will work is that we go through the initiative order for each phase in the checklist. So as movement is the first phase after morale, we work through this list to move everyone wherever they want to go, like this. As we can see, the goblin archers have elected to stay behind the table for cover. The rest have rushed the party. Felonius is watching and waiting again, and Touchbury is eyeing up a shot against the archers. Both Clarion and Belrain moved before Rolf, so have blocked his opportunity to reach the goblins. Rolf curses under his breath. So now we cycle through this initiative sequence again, but for the missile combat phase. The two goblin archers are before Touchbury, so let's resolve their attacks. The first archer can't really see Rolf very well, so will attack the cleric. Ooh, a whopping 19, hits the cleric's AC of 3, and the goblin does a maximum damage of 6. Ouch. Clarion is badly wounded, and might need to heal himself with his only Cure Light Wounds spell. Not a good situation. The second goblin senses blood, and thinks he can take the cleric down, and so targets him, rolling a 16. The d20 got knocked by the damage dice, but you can see the actual roll in the right pane. And the damage is another 6 points. Clarion goes down with 2 goblin arrows to the throat, and in BECMI, 0 hit points means you're dead. This Clarion's gone quiet. Still in the missile combat phase, Touchbury watches his human friend fall and tries to get his revenge. In a rage, he attempts to hit one of the goblins, even though they have cover from the table, giving him a -4 to his hit roll. He rolls an 11 in total, not good enough to hit an armor class of 6, and his arrow clatters off the cave wall harmlessly. Now we're into the magic phase, but none of the party stated they would be casting a spell, and no one has a magic item to use, so we move straight into the hand-to-hand combat phase. The first creature using hand-to-hand to act is the goblin facing Belrain. Emboldened by the fall of the ugly human with the funny hair, he stabs at the elf with his short sword, only achieving a 13. But not enough to beat the elf's armor class of 1. Belrain is next and may reply immediately, targeting the goblin that just tried to harm him. He swings his sword of Alfame and rolls a 1. Terrible. Clearly he is dismayed by the fall of his clerical friend. Although 3 of the goblins still have not attacked, they are not within hand-to-hand range of an enemy, and therefore miss the opportunity to act. Perhaps a bit of fortune for the party. But Rolf can't reach anyone either. So now we move into the second round and must roll initiative again. Who will fortune favour? Let's see. Oh dear, this doesn't look good. Although Belrain gets to go first, 5 goblins go before the next party member. Okay, so let's resolve this movement phase, because there's no need for the goblins to test their morale at this point. It's all looking good. So as we can see, the goblins have pressed the party against the cave wall. Touchbury is forced into hand-to-hand combat, so must delay any combat action until then. Felonius is dreadfully exposed, but has stated he is casting a shield spell, which will improve his AC. He's still holding fire on the sleep spell. As we move into the missile combat phase, only the 2 goblin archers may act. The first targets Belrain and rolls a 3, easily missing the relieved elf. The second also targets the elf and scores a 4. Are things turning around here? We're now into the magic phase, and Felonius casts his shield spell. His armor class is now 2 versus missiles and 4 versus all other attacks. A big improvement on his normal armor class of 9. Now we're into what I think might be some decisive hand-to-hand. Belrain is first in the phase and attacks one of the goblins. He rolls a 3 and completely misses with his sword. It's not his day. Now come the goblin attacks. The first targets Belrain with his short sword, rolling a 2 and missing. The next goblin in the hand-to-hand phase is facing Touchbury and rolls a 20. Ooh, there are no critical hits in BECMI as the rules are written, but a 20 is an automatic hit, and Touchbury takes a maximum of 6 damage and is only on 3 hit points. This is not looking good for the party, and Felonius is thinking he should have fired that sleep spell much earlier. He didn't like Clarion much, but the dumb cleric didn't deserve to die from a goblin arrow. Although it might be a better move to attack Touchbury, the next goblin to take a turn can't help but attack the dwarf in front of him. Rolf nervously tries to avoid the blow, and the goblin gets an 8. Lucky dwarf. Rolf is next to go in the phase and attacks the goblin that attacked him, getting a 20. Okay, and 5 points of damage is enough to bring the goblin down. This combat is too close to call. Now it's Touchbury's opportunity to retaliate to the blow he took, stabbing the goblin in front of him with his short sword, and he rolls a 16, doing 5 points of damage. Another goblin goes down. Revenge for Clarion, maybe. The final attack of the round falls to a goblin facing Belrain, but a roll of 15 is not enough to beat the elf's armor class, and so now we're into round 3. Each creature rolls for initiative again, and it looks like a fair spread of opportunity in this round. Let's get rid of the dead goblins and see where this goes. So the goblins faced some losses in that round, and I think morale checks might be appropriate. They go first in the combat sequence checklist, so let's roll those dice. Okay, so the first one succeeds their morale check and is seeing this through for now. But what about the others? How about this one? He rolls a 7. Another success. Just the 2 archers to check. First one, another success, and the other, another success. Well, the goblins are still up for this. Let's go through the movement phase and see where everyone ends up. So Touchbury withdraws a little to use his bow, whilst Rolf and Belrain try to down the goblins in front of them. Felonius has finally had enough and begins casting a sleep spell on the goblin archers. So the missile combat phase starts with Touchbury loosing an arrow at the goblin closest to him, and getting a 5, which misses. Now for the goblin archers. They will both target the hated dwarf. The first gets a 19. Ooh, these goblins are on fire. The arrow hits for 3 damage, and the next goblin archer is still to have his go. Let's see how they do. Oh my word, another 19, and 4 points of damage. These are worrying times for Rolf. But now we're into the magic phase, and Felonius may cast his sleep spell. In BECMI, there is no save against the sleep spell, although it doesn't affect any creature over what's referred to as 4+1 hit dice. That said, the number of creatures it affects is equal to 2d8 hit dice. This won't be a problem against the 2 goblin archers, but we'll roll anyway. Felonius' sleep spell affects 7 hit dice of creatures within a 40 by 40 feet area. Unfortunately, that only gets the archers, but they're out of the combat and asleep for at least 40 minutes. So now we're into what I think will be the last round of hand-to-hand. First, the goblin facing Belrain tries to strike him and rolls a 15. Oh, it's good, but not enough to hit an armor class of 1. Belrain gets to retaliate immediately, as it's his turn in the hand-to-hand phase. He attacks with his sword and gets a total of 15, doing 6 damage. I think it's the end of the goblins. However, there's one more, and he gets to go before Rolf. Targeting Belrain, he stabs and gets a 9. Not good enough again. Rolf is just in hand-to-hand range and lunges with his sword, cursing all goblins. He hits with a 13 and does 5 damage. The last goblin goes down, and all is silent, but for the sound of snoring at the far end of the tunnel. The party rush to the fallen Clarion, but it is too late. So they loot the cleric for all his stuff and leave him there. He's too heavy to carry anyway, what with the extra loot they now have. Business is business after all. And that's individual initiative, a more dynamic form of using the combat sequence checklist, which also, in my opinion, makes a bit more sense than all of one side taking their go before the other side. That's not to say one is better than the other, it all comes down to personal preference. Whilst on the subject of preference, I should mention the 2 main deviations from the examples I have demonstrated. One is to run individual initiative, but with the monsters all acting on the same initiative value. So that's the characters all on different scores, but all the monsters on 1 score. And the other is to do individual initiative, but ignore the combat sequence checklist entirely, which I have outlined earlier, allowing creatures to take all their actions on their go, reflecting the modern approach. Like I mentioned earlier, nothing is broken by playing around with the initiative and combat sequence in BECMI, which is why I like this edition so much. You can bend it any way you like, but it never seems to break. One rule of combat that didn't seem to come up in my examples is that, as creatures obviously don't stay in one place in a fight and are constantly moving, it can be assumed that when a character attacks, they are also manoeuvring for position. To reflect this limited movement, a character may move up to 5 feet whilst still engaged in fighting, and this movement doesn't count as an action in the round. Remember, they must already be engaged in fighting. That is, they may circle their opponent, etc. It's not an extra 5 feet of movement if you can't reach an opponent after the movement phase, but more like the 5-foot step we saw in 3rd edition, enabling repositioning if tactically appropriate. Okay, so that's BECMI Combat. I hope you enjoyed this run through, and I also hope it made sense. I'd love to know how much it reflects how you play the game, if at all, and if you currently don't play BECMI, have I intrigued you or have I put you off? I'd love to hear from you in the comments. If you've enjoyed this video and it's helped you understand the rules a little more, then please consider buying me a coffee, link on the screen and in the description. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching and being part of the BECMI community. I really hope the combat examples I ran through help with the running of your own games, even if it is to change things to suit your own table. Otherwise, I'm BECMI Berserker. Keep making your saving throws and I hope to see you back here soon.